Well, dear Naya, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
It only took me, I think, 1.5 years of trying to hint at, hey, let's do a podcast together. So finally we made it here in Barcelona. And as you know, I always start with explaining why I was inspired to invite you on the podcast. And so we met each other when I was working with the Randstad for the Customer Delight program. And I think most listeners know that for me, CX and EX is very closely related. So somewhere in the journey, somebody said, maybe you two need to meet.
Uh-huh.
And you were then in Spain, working on employee experience as well.
Yeah.
And we met, we had a virtual meeting. And I would say it's maybe, well, love at first sight, maybe, a bit stretching it. But definitely also content-wise, I think we immediately had a connection.
Yeah.
And I think what really always resonates with me is the energy I see when you talk about this topic. I think you have super valuable insights, so I always feel inspired. And
Thank
that
you.
doesn't happen often, so I thought others might be inspired as well. And when we were prepping this, we thought, hey, maybe one nice story about how connected we were, even before we knew each other, was one story about, I think in March this year, I was prepping a keynote for a session in the Middle East with a client I was working with for, let's say, 100 leaders about CX transformation. And at one point, the question was, hey, Zana, can you maybe also share something about like a definition of CX? Or we need to speak the same language. I thought, okay, definition of CX, kind of boring. And I was prepping that. And then I thought, okay, in essence, it's really simple. And then I used a quote from Maya Angelou that I really love. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But they will never forget how you made them feel. And because I like to share my insights, so I sent you my prep, and then your response was, ha ha ha. I think 3 or 4 years ago, I used the same quote to convince the leaders of Randstad Spain to say why employee experience is important.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're really aligned in, let's say our vision for the world. I think we come both from different perspectives.
Yeah.
That's why I really love to hear more about your vision on human centricity.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, and now I'll stop talking, we always share, hey, what's sort of your history from your studies until where you are now, and just take us a bit on your personal journey.
Okay. So first of all, Hannah, let me thank you for your kind words and for inviting me. I know it has taken 1.5 years to have me here. Maybe I was not ready. I don't even know if I'm ready today, but I think you're trying to do something beautiful, and that's why I'm coming in this journey and adventure with you.
Thanks.
And so about myself, from my studies, so I graduated in organizational psychology. And after a very brief period with another company, I found Randstad. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I thought it was going to be like a 2 to 3 year journey.
As many Randstad people will say to me.
Yeah, exactly. But next month, it is 20 years that I joined Randstad. And probably one of the reasons why I have stayed for so long is because in Randstad I have found a place where you can really grow and learn. And how I have experienced Randstad is like it is a huge skills playground, and that has been important for me. So I started as an operational talent solution consultant, and then 2 years later I moved to a branch manager role. So for half of my career at Randstad, I was linked to business, managing different branches, also involved in merges, etc. Also leading our foundation in Catalonia. So. But then in 2015, I was given the opportunity to join the HR team in Spain as an HR business partner. Yeah. Then 2 years later, I was given the opportunity to be the head of employee experience and leading the HRBP team. And 1.5 years ago, I joined the Global Talent COB. And currently, I take care of culture, engagement, performance. And one of our big projects I manage is employee value proposition. Mm-hmm. So, 20 years in the same employer, but the experience has been constantly moving, and I'm super grateful for the people I have found on my way, and also for having found a place that was resonating good with my values, with myself, right? It is a bit scary to say 20 years, but honestly, what I feel is I'm very thankful, very grateful for this journey. And that's 20 years in a nutshell.
Yeah. And what made you say, because you switched from the business to HR?
Yeah.
What was sort of for you the trigger where you felt, hey, I think that's a nice switch to make?
Well, that was initially my goal, right? When I studied psychology and I graduated, I always thought about human resources. So to end up in the business was kind of unexpected, but we are a service company, so within the business there is a lot of, it's all about human connections, right? So that's why I really enjoy it a lot. But there was a moment that I really wanted to go to my career goal kind of thing. That's why I switched.
Nice. I think one of the topics that we'll definitely be diving into is also leadership, right? One of the topics that you really are passionate about.
Yeah.
What makes you passionate about the topic of leadership, culture, but I think even more so leadership?
So I think leaders, they play a pivotal role, like shaping, any leader. Either it could be organizations, it could be communities, it could be society, right?
Yeah.
So I think probably I have a belief behind that leadership is a way for a better world, whatever the system is. I think that's what makes me passionate about leadership. Yeah. I see an opportunity there.
Yeah, to influence maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, we are talking now about the podcast around the human-centric CEO, right? Human centricity.
Yeah.
And I tend to frame it as consisting of 3 pillars, right? For me, it's the customers, employees, and purpose. But what's your perception? What does human centricity mean to you? And why do you think it matters to companies these days? Why should they embrace it?
Okay, I will start with the latest, why it matters for the business, because then the other is my personal view. So I think human centricity impacts, it impacts customer satisfaction, it impacts employee engagement, it impacts brand reputation, it impacts the way you innovate, because it's also how you design, for other stakeholders. So I think at the end of the day, all these pillars and others are linked to sustainable growth. So human centricity is really impacting, sustainable growth, because through human centricity, what you're doing is you're linking business with the expectations of your different stakeholders, not only shareholders, but also your clients, also your employees, in our case, also our talents,
Yeah.
So it's like building a foundation for a sustainable relationship. So that means success. So I think that's why it's important for business, right? And in my personal view, so I think it's the right thing to do. Also, caring about the people we impact, and I think it's the wise thing to do, because it's like a win-win situation. It's you're taking care of the business and you're taking care of the people. So I think it's quite balanced approach and sustainable approach.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I like what you mentioned when we were prepping this together, while driving in the car towards the mountains of Barcelona, by the way. Yeah. You mentioned, I think what I like is you also mentioned it's about the needs of the different shareholders, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's very needs-based. Can you elaborate a bit more? What do you mean with really taking care of the needs of all the different stakeholders?
Yeah. So when a company is human-centric, the behaviors they show, like when do you know that a company is human-centric, right? Like it's basically how they make things, how they behave, and that could be in the decision-making, like the way you make decisions, you put the needs and well-being of the stakeholders that will be impacted by those decisions, be that customers or employees, and you try to kind of take care of the simultaneous interest of all the
shared
people. Exactly, right? So that's when decision making. When you're doing building solution for clients, you're doing it from a customer-centered perspective based on their needs. Maybe you display behaviors that go through compassionate leadership. So it's like you really take into account the needs of the people you're impacting, the stakeholders you're impacting. And those could be different people in different moments, and sometimes they are, some of them are the same, at the same moment. And what you're trying to do is to have a calibrated view of everything, to know how they impact each other, and then you take the most equilibrated decision,
What do you think is the risk of, because, well, you and I are both fans of human centricity, but I also think a lot of companies are maybe not embracing this yet. I think there's more and more, also in the podcast with Dan, there's more and more also research proving that it matters. But what do you think is the risk of a company not embracing human centricity?
Well, I think it's long-term sustainability. I think in the short term, you can sometimes be very successful when you are short-sighted, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't look after your customers, they will come in, but they will leave.
Yeah.
If you don't look after your employees, maybe they will join the company, but they will go,
Yeah.
So I think the risk is maybe not today, but yes, tomorrow for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Longer term.
Yeah.
And you mentioned already one of the topics that we also talked about is, okay, when do you know that an organization is human-centric? But also, well, one of my struggles in the last 25 years is how do you make this soft, fluffy thing called experience? How can you make this measurable? Because we need to speak the language of the organization that is maybe not yet embracing this. Right? So how can we make it hard steerable? How can we prove it has financial benefits?
Yeah.
And one of my attempts has been to create a survey where from each of the 3 pillars, we ask questions, so around the customer, around employee, and around purpose. And to then figure out, okay, what from all these statements has the biggest impact on the emotional engagement of employees. So I have 2 questions. One is, when do you think we can say an organization is human-centric? But also, how can we measure it to convince the rest of the world?
Okay. So I think we can say an organization is human-centric when they display the kind of behaviors I have just described, like when in their designing process, they are really taking customer needs into account, like when they really think of the employees' needs, when taking decisions also, or when they make like social commitments for the social impact they will have, like in their chain of decisions, they have a broader view of how a concrete decision impacts rather than just the bottom line, which of course you need to take into account.
Yeah, it's a balance.
I think when you do that consistently, it's not just like one-off or one time, when that's like the way you behave, then you can say company is human-centric. But of course, that it's very hard to measure. And I think to measure whether a company is human-centric, you need to look at different metrics at different dimensions, qualitative, quantitative metrics. And I think for different pillars. So, for example, if you want to know how you're doing with your customers, you have NPS, or you have also customer retention.
She mentioned NPS.
I know. I know your view of that. So no worries.
I'm just kidding.
But so that just people. That's a very well-known measure. So or customer retention. That's very simple. Like how many come in, but how many leave you. That's when a customer stays with you, it's a healthy signal, right? And that's what you want. Like you want long-term relationships, right? So that could be one dimension you can measure. From employees, then you have engagement and also voluntary turnover, right? Those are metrics that are letting you know how well you're doing.
Yeah.
Or you can have metrics to measure organizational like culture health, like in terms of diversity and inclusion metrics, or well-being metrics. So, or you have the CSR impact, like social impact metrics.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think there is one thing
Holy
to
metric.
say, holy metric.
Yeah.
But I think you can look at different dimensions of your stakeholders, and also if the share price is going up, so. You need to really look at different dimensions of the company and see if they are going good, in a way that this will be sustainable. Because, of course, you have like short-term outcomes, which is the P&L, the
sales, for example.
Sales, gross profit, EBITDA, and the results of today. But if you want to do that tomorrow and continue growing, you need to look at the other midterm metrics, and the temperature that your customers give you, your employees give you, are very important to look after, to know how well you're doing, to keep on growing, to build that sustainable relationship that we were talking at the beginning. So,
and you think, because I think that's a tricky balance that most companies face, right? The short term, easy to measure. I see tomorrow if I did more sales. I don't see tomorrow if I have more churn. What do you think? What are ways, or maybe you have examples on how can we help leaders to balance that, right? So they don't lose themselves in the daily. It's easy to lose yourself in the daily steering of the harder data, right? So what can we do? Maybe some concrete tips. Okay, how do we make sure that I don't lose sight? Yes, I balance, but how do I don't lose sight on also the employee side, the customer side, the purpose side of things?
Yeah. So I think we need to tackle something, and sometimes there is a hard reality in the PNL, right?
Yeah.
And that's like that, because this is when everything goes well, it's super easy.
Exactly.
The question probably that people are thinking is, okay, this is super easy what you're saying, but what happens when, you're not meeting your targets, and, you
Exactly.
sometimes you have to do tough decisions. So human centricity is not about not making tough decisions, but it's about making them in a human way. So I will give you a very concrete example.
Yeah.
So imagine that you need to lay off people, and maybe that's a reality, and that's like that. But the way you do it, things that you can do before laying off people, can have a human-centric approach. And this could be, for example, you can have a pool of people that you really need to let go, but not because of performance, but because company situation. Why not create a pool where the ITA team can look at them and try to maybe put them in another place, at least give them the chance. And that's a human way of behaving, because you're taking the decision, and maybe you are letting that people go because that's the hard reality. But how you do it, or maybe you don't have the possibility to do that. Okay, but why don't you offer an outplacement program as part of your social responsibility? There are ways. It's not about not taking hard decisions, because sometimes they are needed. It's about doing that in a human way. Thinking of the needs and trying to balance. And things are not perfect, but you can try to have the best possible impact you can within the context that you have. So.
Yeah. And I think it's also. So I'm thinking two bridges now. I'm just thinking, which one am I taking? Because you also mentioned the word culture. And one of the things, I think it was Peter Drucker who said, right, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And you said, I think leadership eats culture for breakfast. Please elaborate.
I'm super convinced that the big fish is leadership. And like I said before, leaders shape many things. In this case, I'm convinced that they shape the culture of the organization. And because culture is like the personality of the organization in a way, right? And it can seem something very abstract when we talk about culture. But at the end of the day, what is culture? And making it very simple, simple. Culture is the behaviors that we support, right? Like how we behave. And behind behaviors, we have values and we have beliefs. So that guides the way we communicate, the way we recognize, the way we celebrate, this kind of thing. So that's why I think the leadership is culture, because basically the way they behave is shaping.
That's where it starts.
That's where it starts. Of course, then you have policies, to shape also all that. But it really starts with how leaders behave. And one thing is sure about culture. Like culture will always happen. By default or by design. So I think it's worth being mindful about that, because the way leaders behave is really setting the tone of an organization together with other, procedures, policies, whatever. It's not only their behavior, but that's really what is impacting in the everyday relationship, in the way we do things.
And we didn't prepare this question, so shoot me if.
No
but I'm triggered because if you could design the utopia version of a leadership development program, right? So I have a lot of conversations also with HR colleagues, right? When we're doing transformation. If you could design the ultimate program, what are sort of the top 3 things that you would definitely want to put in that program to support this human-centric dream that we have?
Okay, I never thought about this question before, but what pops up naturally, I would put in that program compassion. So I would teach about compassion.
Why?
Because I think compassion is the most accountable way of behaving. I really think it has a lot of potential for the leaders and for the people around them. So it's a win-win kind of way. So it's a very constructive way of being in the world and adding value to others and to yourself, and very equilibrated, even more than empathy. You can really feel burnout from out of empathy, you know, because empathy is you feel how the others are feeling, but you don't take action, and that can really take you to burnout. But compassion, it really has an accountability part of it. It really empowers, because you understand it, but you go beyond and you feel able to do something about it,
Can you, because I think that's super interesting, because I think for you it's super logical in your brain. Can you elaborate a bit more on the difference between empathy and compassion? Because I think that's super relevant.
Yeah. So I think there are different dimensions of feeling how other people feel. You know, you can have sympathy.
Yeah.
You can have empathy, which
Yeah.
is, hey, I really resonate with what you're feeling. I can really understand that, you know, you're happy or you're suffering. Or, you know, you take like the emotional weight of the other part, but it stops there. You don't do anything. And just being taking that all the time, you know, can feel heavy.
Yeah, isn't too much.
Yeah, but compassion is, I understand, but I actually, you know, want to do something about it. I feel that, so it's a step forward rather than empathy. And compassion works in a way that it works for you, and it works for the other person that you are, you know, like interacting with. So I think that's the value of compassion. So for sure, I could make my leadership.
So one priority, compassion.
Is
okay.
That could be one.
Yeah.
And as I said, I didn't reflect about this question before, but what else could be in that? I think a lot of skills related to this, you know, because it comes with self-awareness and it comes. So it's deep work.
Yeah, self-reflection, right?
Yeah, I think it could be like the outside-in journey, you know. So it could be a leadership development program that really connects leaders with their own needs, you know.
Yeah.
Like trying to align their intrinsic needs that they have as humans, because we are all humans at the end of the day, you know, together with their role. You know, so that they can thrive. This from the part of more like more leadership skills. Of course, you need the executive skills too, you know. But now I'm just concentrated. We are assuming that. So that's why I'm concentrated only in this part. But I could do that. Yeah.
And then when, let's say, I'm the CEO and I'm convinced about this human-centric dream.
Yeah.
But my fellow colleagues are maybe not yet convinced. And one thing that really resonated with me is when we were prepping, you mentioned, so my question, I think, in each podcast is, okay, but how can we inspire the other leaders to embrace it as well? And you mentioned that what's relevant is that they experience, they feel it. Can you explain why? And can you maybe give some examples? How can we let them experience this?
Yeah, okay. Why do I think they need to experience this? Is this I learned from one of my professors in the master coaching. They said that to really understand something, you need to pass it through your muscle. So I believe in that a lot. And so if a CEO is convinced and he needs to convince other executives, I think I could do a strategy that first speaks their language and then it connects them emotionally. Because you cannot talk about human centricity and do it from a rational perspective only, right? Because human centricity is about connection and it's about that human part. So you need to make like a journey. So maybe, and you cannot only do that also in a workshop or in a 1-hour meeting. So I think you really need to take them through a journey.
It's not a one-off thing.
It's not a one-off thing, exactly. And maybe to start the journey, I could make like an intervention of 3 interventions or something with that executive team. The first one could be in their own language. They tap into the prefrontal cortex with data, you know, and research and data points, like why human centricity matters, you know, and like showing research, like from McKinsey, Gallup, you know, like really real data, you know, like
business benefits. You mean?
Exactly. Yeah. Let's be rational about it, you know, why it matters, and let's approach it from a data point of view, right?
We can grow the business through this.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And you can do it from an outcome perspective, you can do it from a risk mitigation perspective, whatever. You know, but that language really resonates because it's kind of linked to the bottom line, you know? You can really connect the profitability and everything. But of course, that's not enough for you to embrace human centricity as a leader, right? So that sets you the tone like, okay, maybe
there's something there.
There is something there.
Yeah.
And then I think you need to take your leaders through a journey of reflection, and you cannot do that in one go. And you need to then appeal to the limbic system, so the emotional part of it. And in that journey, I could start with the past of those people, like when you were a customer and when you were an employee, like think of a moment, that impacted you negatively, whatever, so that it's out of any context, but that they can connect.
How did you feel at that moment?
Exactly, and that's about the past. And then so you have heard like rational arguments.
Yeah.
Now they are trying to connect it with your own personal experience.
Yeah.
And then I could close the session, giving some homeworks. And I could say, okay, for the next 1-2 weeks, whatever, in every decision you take, just think, who are you thinking of? Kind of bring like, maybe think a week back, what decisions you took, like in the last 15 days.
Yeah.
And for the next 15 days, just every time you make a decision, like, well, not all the time, but, at least pick some examples and reflect on how did you take it? What was your driver? And because then you really take them through a journey.
Yeah.
And then you can again meet
Yeah.
and share. What did you learn? What happened to you? What were your insights? And then challenges come here. Look, I tried to have this decision, but I found really difficult, maybe to reconcile or, and then group learning is happening.
Yeah.
But then you're really driving behaviors, kind of thing. And so that could be something that could last for a few, few times. And then there is also something like the ultimate question for me would be like, what do you want to achieve as a leader? What is the legacy that you want to leave? Because at the end of the day, like humans, we have different levels of needs. Like we have the need of connection, we have the need of recognition, right? We have the need of like achieving things like self-fulfillment, but also the transcendence, right?
Yeah.
So I think when you connect, and leaders usually are in a position that they can really impact others, so it's like, think about what is the legacy you want to leave? Do you just want to leave a positive P&L?
Yeah.
Or do you want your journey through here to be a bit more? And if so, what is it and how, So at the end, you really need to connect with the limbic system of the people.
Yeah, and I think that's also very connected to the purpose, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
indeed, why are you here? Why are you here as a leader? And one thing that popped up in my, let's say, in your program, a thing that might be also interesting, I thought maybe you were going there, is also that you, maybe in, I don't know, in step 3.5, where you ask employees, right? That you ask employees feedback about how that leader makes them feel.
Yeah, of course. You can make a lot of things. This was just like, this is just like a snapshot of what could be, interventions. But of course, I think it's super
your
valuable.
list of interventions is interesting for the listeners. So if you have more on your list, keep them coming.
No, but I think this is a really good one. Like a 360 is always insightful for a leader, I think, because then you really understand how you're impacting, your peers, your teams, and I think that's a very valuable tool.
And how do you make, because I think some leaders are a bit anxious, right, to really have a full open 360. How can you make it more safe for them, that they are okay to really listen to what others are saying about them?
So I think that has to do with how vulnerable you're able to feel, right? And also how a bit self-compassion, like it comes from a place where you feel calm. I mean, if you accept, like as a leader, you do your best, but of course you are a human, so you're not going to be perfect. And if you have a growth mindset, so anything that I will hear that maybe it's not where it needs to be, it's an opportunity to become a better version of myself. So
Learning.
It's how you frame that feedback. If you frame it like an exam, like, because this is like judgment, then I think it can feel very heavy because, of course, it's judgment, and it's like, okay, and then you're judging yourself. The problem is not what they are telling you, but it's what you are telling to yourself.
How you digest it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you are okay and you're humble enough to understand that each of us, all of us, we are never done. We can always go farther and we can always learn more about ourselves. And that will never end if you have a growth mindset.
Yeah.
I think it's a huge present because you maybe were not aware that you were making people feel certain way, for positive or negative.
Yeah.
And if you spot positive things, it's good that you anchor them if you were not aware, because then you know that they are bringing value.
Yeah,
You know,
when strength maybe, right?
Exactly.
You discover. Yeah.
But if you're doing something that maybe it's not so positive, it's what a present it is, that you told me that.
Yeah.
Because now I have an opportunity to be a better version of myself. And I think, that's the best commitment you can do as a leader, right?
Yeah.
And as a person, even not a leader, any of us, like if we are committed to be a better version of ourselves a little bit, our mistakes are the way for that. And so it's not like a result, it's just like a situation.
Process.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think also the personal journey and the professional journey, for me, it's always been strange that people split, right? I have a work personality and I have a personal personality. That doesn't work, but for me, that's such a strange concept, right? I hope that more and more people are, willing and able to just bring their full self to work, right? And feel okay with that.
Yeah.
Some examples. So you mentioned already some examples how you design the program, but also what I often see is that the focus maybe is, okay, we want to do transformation, and we focus on a C-level need to do something. But then we tend to skip, but hey, what about team leaders, managers, and directors? Can you maybe give an example of, okay, I'm embracing human centricity for those 4 levels. What is maybe one concrete thing that I can do with my team to, start the human centricity journey? Is there something specific, an activity, a behavior, something that I can do for each of those 4 levels?
So I think I wouldn't make a distinction for any of the levels, because at the end of the day is leadership behaviors. So of course, when it comes to competencies, you will expect maybe different levels of proficiency, depending on the responsibility you have.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're leading people, you're impacting people, so you need to listen. No matter whether you lead a team of 5 people or whether you lead a team of 100 people. You know what I mean? Like active listening, of course, maybe you will do it a bit differently in the ways that you arrive, because you cannot listen maybe 1 by 1 to 100 people. You know what I mean? But the essence of the behaviors are the same. So the way you listen and be open to feedback, don't take it personal, but just like we were saying, as an opportunity to understand, I think...
Are specific questions there where you feel those are very powerful questions that you maybe came across that I could use? So next to active listening, what should I be asking?
I think it's not so much about questions. I think it's more about behaviors, So it's more about listening. It's about empowering your team, so not micromanaging, It's about being there, so you're empowering, but you're not losing responsibility. And it means that you're trying to understand what's going on, and then if something is going on, you also come in to, row with the team and find a solution. It is about taking accountability, not just holding other accountables. You hold yourself accountable for the results, but you're there to help,
To support them.
Yeah, to support. So those kind of behaviors, like listening, like supporting your team, understanding what they need and being willing to be involved are very, I would say, on one hand, simple behaviors.
But simple but not easy.
Yeah. But it's like... I think those are some examples,
Yeah, and when it comes to transformation and leadership, I think HR has a very big role in most organizations. And, I come from the human centricity angle from CX. So I always say CX transformation that fosters human centricity. I'm not the one that creates a human-centric culture. I think that's where we definitely also need HR. But I think we are both also aligned that HR tends to be very operational. Right, not necessarily the transformational version. If HR would support the transformation, can you give some examples on, let's say, some key HR processes like the onboarding or rewards? So what should we change to support this human-centric transformation that we want to achieve?
So I think I would start from the same thing that we were talking. So first, I would start from company behaviors. So what are the values that we expect from all our employees? You really need some values that guide you, you know, because if as an employee I'm clear about what is the company expected from me in terms of behavior, you know, that already is setting the tone,
It's
you
telling
know.
me something.
Yeah, it's telling me something,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
way I will treat clients, the way I would approach, you know. So those could be like company values, company behaviors for all employees. But then also it would be nice as an employee if I know what can I expect from my leaders? What kind of behaviors do we support? So I think it's interesting to have like a leadership manifesto, you know, like saying like, what do we expect from leaders? Do we expect that they explain why, for example? That's part.
Yeah.
Do we expect that they, for example, recognize? Do we expect, for example, that they communicate in a transparent way? Do we expect, for example, that they maybe are challenging, you know?
Yeah.
You know, like what kind of behaviors? And that doesn't need to be very wide, but, you know,
It makes it super tangible.
Yeah, very tangible.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, the company expects this from me as an employee, and the company expects this from managers. So this is what I can expect, that they are going to be transparent with me, you know, that they are going to explain me the why of the decisions, they are going to recognize me, you know.
Yeah.
These kind of things that can be very, very tangible.
Yeah, nice.
So I think to start, because in coherence to the conversation, you know, what we were saying, I would start by defining the leadership behaviors and the leadership model that we want, because they are going to be the ones that have the most power.
Drive the culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So your leadership development program should reflect that in first place. Then, of course, if you have certain values, you will include them in your selection process, recruitment process, right? So you don't only recruit skills, but also maybe,
DNA level.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So then, of course, there are more things that you can do, but I would start from there.
Yeah.
Indeed.
All right. I'm just checking in the back of my mind the list of what we prepped, and I think we covered a lot of topics already.
Yeah.
I was thinking about asking you, but I don't want to put you on the spot because you mentioned legacy, right? So I also... in each interview, I ask the CEO as well, what do you hope, and not your P&L, but for example, you know, if they have kids, what do you hope that your kids and the people that work with you say about you, I don't know, 5 years from now? What would be your legacy? What do you hope to achieve in the world?
Me personally?
You personally, yes.
Well, I hope to make a positive impact where I'm involved, you know. So at the moment, I'm at Randstad, so I hope I contribute with my way of thinking and my way of influencing that Randstad can continue being a really good place to work, you know. So I hope I can contribute positively to the environments I'm involved with, and that is at work, but also I hope with my friends, right, and my family. So
the people around you.
Yeah, I think, and that would be my aim. That if I'm not longer here, that at least they can say, "Hey, Naya brought something positive to my life."
Also, while you're still here, right? It might also be nice.
Well, but usually you hear that when you're not.
I will now say inshallah with my Middle East experience, right? Hopefully.
Yeah. I think bringing something good. And I think that's an opportunity we all have.
Yeah.
You know, and that doesn't mean being perfect at all. I mean, it means making mistakes, it means learning, but like an intention, you know, like being mindful about the way you interact with other people, you know, and caring. I think you need to care. So when you were telling me before about human centricity, like how to intervene, you know, how to speak to those people, I think there are something that you cannot fake, and this is care. Whether you care or you don't care. And if you don't care, look, it's very difficult, you know? But if you're able to tap into that part, and I think people usually care, you know, if you can tap that, I think there is a huge potential, you know?
I think that's a nice positive ending to our conversation, right? There's a lot of potential in the world. I also feel that more and more people are embracing this.
Yeah.
Maybe it's also because new generations are asking more for it, right? There's more need for purpose.
Yeah.
So let's hope that our podcast has added another tiny drop in the ocean of creating more human centricity.
Yeah.
My question that I always end with, anything that we forgot to cover? Anything that pops up, hey, this is something I want to add.
Well, maybe a topic that I think it's super important for leaders is psychological safety. So this didn't come through the questions, but I think it's very much linked to fostering a workplace where people can thrive, and I think it's super important because psychological safety is like the condition, so that trust can flourish, and a well-being environment is created. And there is one experiment. I don't know. Do you know the marshmallow experiment, Sana?
The marshmallow experiment?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So shall I share it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So there is this experiment that they did with business graduates, kindergarten kids. You know which one?
No, I don't think so, but I'm getting an idea where it might be going.
Yeah, and lawyers.
Yes.
Okay. And the goal was, with spaghettis and some things that they were given, you needed to create the tallest freestanding tower with a marshmallow on top.
Okay.
Okay, so they had all these samples. They carried the experiment several times, and you know what they found in every time?
Tell me.
Like kindergarteners were the one achieving.
Yeah, that's what I thought would be the outcome, the painful outcome. And why?
And the reason why is because it was not a skills issue. Probably the CEOs, lawyers, and business, they had more skills, than kindergartners. But it was about human connection.
Ah, really?
Human interaction.
I was going to think maybe about, out of the box thinking.
No. It's a human interaction. And while adults were more engaged, like from a psychological perspective view, okay, what might they think about me, because we're wired for connection. And we're wired, to thrive in a community. That's like our biological condition. So we don't want to be judged or things like that. Yeah, we want to fit in, right? So like adults play more this kind of game, while kids,
let's go.
Yeah, let's go. And they were building on top of each other, and they were still not so aware of that, And so they collaborated better.
Nice.
So I think that it's nice experiments that shows that how important human connections are on top of skills, to achieve things, and also how important it is to feel psychologically safe to thrive. And it's super important for the company, right?
Yeah.
Because psychological safety fosters innovations.
And
it taps to a part of the people that you cannot buy. So you can hire the smartest person, But if you don't let that person be, of that person fears, of speaking up, of any, it's like you didn't hire the smartest person.
You don't get the potential out of it.
Exactly. And what differentiates your company from others is the potential that you have in there. So you need to make that knowledge and potential flourish. So I think human centricity also is linked to psychological safety.
Needs that, right? As
As some
prerequisites.
Yeah. It's not like what facilitates the rest of the things. It's like a good precondition.
It's the brakes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You keep on the brakes if you don't feel safe.
Exactly. Yeah. You need to unlock that.
Exactly.
For the rest of the things to happen.
To accelerate.
Yeah. So I think psychological safety would be another thing I could teach about in that program. So.
Exactly. And do you also then, to finish your ideal program, like 1 or 2 tips, behaviors that leaders can do to enhance psychological safety?
I think is allowing a mistaking. That's I think how you behave when somebody doesn't get it right. Is it doesn't matter what you say. If what
you cannot fake that.
Exactly. Like how you behave in this moment says much more than what you're trying to say, with your speech. So I think like to view failures like as a growing and learning journey, I think is super important. I have a very nice example of that. I felt it once in my skin. I made a mistake with one of our CEOs back in Spain, and I thought, okay, I need to face this. And I phoned him and I said, look, I have done a mistake. And then he listened to me, and it was not about saying, hey, Naya, you haven't done a mistake. No, I had done it.
Yeah,
And
you were owning it.
I was owning it.
Yeah.
And he was saying, yeah, you did it.
Yeah.
But then he told me something very, very important that I have kept, inside me. And he said, look, Nayara, we all make mistakes. Nobody is free of mistakes. The most important thing is that we do as few as possible, and then that the ones that we make have the least impact as possible. And yours has very little impact. Yeah, so I think that is leadership.
Yeah.
That is a very concrete behavior, when it's not about denying or it's not about making it look what it's not.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
It is a mistake. I own it and you recognize it and I'm accountable for it, right? But then it's also giving the room to, to say, hey, it's part of your journey and let's try not to do it again. But
Yeah.
so this is, I think, a nice example, eh?
Yeah, makes it very tangible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my dear Naya, I would say muchas gracias
De nada.
para nuestra conversación.
Yeah.
If people want to find you, LinkedIn, what would be a way to connect with you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn. Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Right.
Well,
Good one.
thanks so much.
No, thank you for having me.
My pleasure.